Hi, welcome to now your fourth PowerPoint. This is a PowerPoint introducing Wheeler-Becker Glover, Volume 1, Chapter 6. This is the chapter that deals with the Sunday mail controversy. And I realize that does not sound very sexy from the title, but it's actually a very interesting chapter, at least it was for me. So let's get right into it. One of the things the chapter does is it really helps us get at these potential answers to questions that are still around about America's religious identity, particularly its religious identity at its founding. So one of the questions this chapter helps to address a little bit is the extent to which the United States was founded on Christian principles. And you're going to see, even while you're reading the background section, there were debates about that, even in the 1800s. So that might be somewhat reassuring, or it might not be reassuring, depending on where you are. But just to give you a sense that this is still a controversial topic, one of the chapters you're not going to have time to read is the very last chapter in the second volume. So this is Wheeler-Becker Glover, Volume 2, Chapter 11. And that includes a chapter on the Texas textbook controversy. And one of the main issues in that question about what should American school children be taught about their history is a question about America's religious foundations. And some people said, hey, there needs to be more attention to this. And some people said, look, you're asking them to study a myth, etc., etc. So it's still alive and well, and maybe some of you have had some personal experience with that. So what is the chapter about? Well, let's take a look at the next slide here. Well, there's Thomas Jefferson. He's a very controversial figure when it comes to what American school children should be taught today. If you're somebody who would like to see more emphasis on America's religious founding, you might want to de-emphasize Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was a deist. This was somebody who believed that God had perhaps created the universe, but that God was in many ways like a clockmaker. So he had made the clock, wound it up, and then sort of stepped back and let it happen, and that the world then was sort of governed by natural laws rather than supernatural intervention. He was also famous for cutting out the miraculous portions of his Bible and having just then a very rational Bible. So if you're someone who wants to stress the religious foundation of the country, you might want to de-emphasize Thomas Jefferson's role. So for some people, he's a hero for his promotion of liberty, but for others, he's more this deist villain. And maybe that's overstating it a little bit, but you get the idea. So this debate about whether or not America was founded as a Christian nation then in some ways does mirror the debate in the Sunday mail controversy. So you're going to see very similar issues come up in both contexts. So some of the issues that came up in the Sunday mail controversy, and maybe you've even heard today, those who tend to see less religious influence, and so who would celebrate Thomas Jefferson, would say, look, there is very little attention to religion in the United States Constitution. There's very, 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 very little mention of it whatsoever. Secondly, they would point out that the very First Amendment sets up this clear wall of separation between church and state, state being another fancy way of saying the nation. We don't mean little s state like New York or Massachusetts. We mean the state as in United States, the nation. You're going to read more about the clear wall of separation in the First Amendment in the background of the textbook. The other thing that the textbook points out is that there was in fact declining church membership in the 1770s, and even though there were Sunday observance laws in effect, many of those laws were simply ignored by the public in the 1770s. So this in some ways goes back to the end of the Anne Hutchinson lecture when I said, you know, Anne Hutchinson perhaps is not the biggest threat to Puritan ideals, it's time and expansion. And so more time has now passed since even the late 1670s, 1680s, where you had the First Great Awakening trying to bring people back to religious conscience, and you see that, you know, things have taken a downward spiral in terms of religious commitment, at least in terms of church membership. What's also notable, though, is that even religious folks celebrate the Constitution's silence on religion. And what you should note is that the religious folks who celebrate the Constitution's silence on religion comes from those who are in the religious minority. So if you are not a member of, say, the Church of England or its successor in this country, the Episcopal Church, or the Congregational Church, which is the main, Puritan Church, or you're not a member of even, say, the Presbyterian Church or some of those mainline religions, but say you're a Baptist or say you're a Jew, you're going to appreciate that the Constitution does not set up an established church, that there is no national church, the Church of America, that your tax money goes to, et cetera, because what is the Church of America likely to be? It's not going to be the religion of the religious minority, like the Baptist Church. So Baptists in particular were very excited that they were not going to be forced to support the religious majority. So the Baptists do celebrate the separation clause, and they were actually some of the biggest people pressuring James Madison, who actually came up with the first several amendments to the Constitution. They celebrate the separation clause because they see it as allowing for religious diversity and for them to be able to practice their religion in freedom. We don't want to have a situation where we have several Ann Hutchinsons being booted out because they object to the state church. So even though I have Thomas Jefferson pictured here, Thomas Jefferson was actually James Madison's mentor, and Thomas Madison set up the clear wall of separation because the First Amendment is modeled on something that he set up for the state of Virginia in its constitution. All right, moving along. There's Ezra. He's somebody you're gonna read in the evidence section. He is going to be someone who is very upset that the post office is being allowed to remain open on Sunday. So, as your textbook points out, okay, sure, the Constitution doesn't mention religion. The First Amendment sets up this clear wall of separation. But does that mean that America is not a Christian nation and wasn't a Christian nation at its founding? Well, your textbook points out it's not that simple. Just because the Constitution doesn't legislate religion, that doesn't mean the United States wasn't a Christian nation. So we don't have a legislated Church of America. We don't have a state church. Well, does that necessarily negate the fact that the United States wasn't a Christian nation? Was the federal government mainly silent on the issue of religion because it was being deferential to state laws and practices? And as your textbook points out, even though we don't have a national church, we do have at the state level various state established churches. So Massachusetts, which is one of the bigger holdouts in terms of having an established church, but all the way into the 1830s. In the 1830s, even if you were a Baptist living in Massachusetts, if you paid taxes in one form or another through property or whatnot, a portion of those taxes would go to support the Congregational Church because that was the state church of Massachusetts. So, you might not like the fact that the Congregational Church is getting preferential treatment, but there you have a whole, state church in Massachusetts, and several other states had them too. So just because we don't have a federal policy with regard to Christianity, that doesn't mean that several states didn't have a Christian identity and a particular denomination identity. And of course, the other thing that your textbook points out is the founders. Many of them did expect that citizenship would be based on a religious-based morality. People thought, if you were going to be a good citizen, of course you were going to be someone who was religious, because where else were your morals going to come from? And that's certainly the view of someone like John Adams, for example, who is probably a little bit more lauded by people who would like to point to a more Christian identity. And he is important. And in some ways, he's right? And of course, this other point here, isn't religion crucial for the makeup of a virtuous citizen and thus the republic as a whole? So there's actually a lot of emphasis on making sure that children received moral instruction, because who did we want running this country? We wanted citizens who were capable of acting in the public good, and they were acting according to a higher morality. So, you know, it's not necessarily fair to say that just because we don't have language at the national level about religion, that we are not necessarily a country with a fairly large religious identity. But as you can see, it's a very complicated situation, and there's no easy answer. And for those of you who are not historians, that might be very frustrating. But you know what? That's also life. There's no easy answer in life either, and there sure wasn't back in the 1800s either. So we shouldn't expect that to be the case. Really, if there's no easy answer, then you get to flex your brain muscle a little bit more because you have to consider so many possibilities. Okay, moving on though. The other thing that you should pay attention to, that's a little understated maybe in this chapter, but it's going to get mentioned in the next 2 chapters that you read. So this is something that gets mentioned in 3 different chapters that you're reading in this class. So the Second Great Awakening. The person you're seeing there is Charles Grandison Finney, and I admit I am biased there. I did take a representation of him from his younger years when he had a little bit more hair. He's not maybe quite so stunning looking as an older man, but you can Google him if you want to see some of those other images. But the Second Great Awakening then is an important historical backdrop to the Sunday Mail controversy. And your textbook points out that it is a reaction in part to tremendous changes occurring in the United States in the early 19th century. Really, this is our first industrial revolution. We're kind of late when it comes to having our first industrial revolution. Great Britain was much earlier than we were, but this is the era in the early 1800s where we're seeing major improvements in transportation. So this is when you have the canal building. This is where you have road building. You have the early experimentation with railroads. There's changes with regard to economics. We see the development of the first factories. We're seeing changes in the workforce. We get our first trickle of immigrants from Ireland in the 1830s, only to grow much greater in the 1840s. And so the country is very much changing, not only in terms of its visual landscape, but also in terms of its cultural landscape, because of course the Irish are mainly Catholic. So you have another religious minority coming in great numbers in the 1830s, and then more so in the 1840s. But what is the Second Great Awakening then? It's a more emotional expression of religious revival. So, it's in some ways a way to respond to the changes by reasserting traditional values, but kind of in a new form. So people like Charles Grandison Finney would go to tent meetings and preach exciting sermons that were convicting to people about their sin. People would fall over on their chairs. There was wailing, gnashing of teeth, etc. What's also really important about this, and this does not get mentioned specifically by this term in the textbook, so this is something to write down if you are taking notes. There is a distinct theology, and this is the theology of perfectionism. So your textbook refers to it just briefly on 142 by saying that many evangelical preachers predicted that good works to improve society would hasten the second coming of Jesus Christ. So I think that most Christians do believe that Jesus Christ will at some point return to the earth and establish some kind of rule over the earth. The question has always been, when is that going to happen? And people who believed in the theology of the Second Great Awakening basically thought that they could hasten the second coming of Jesus Christ by making a perfect world here on earth by ridding it of its various sins. And so the goal here is not only the removal of personal sin, so it's not just a personal transformation, but it's also a social transformation. So what this does then, because they're interested in social transformation, not just personal transformation, this encouraged the formation of societies that were aimed at stamping out the various sins of the contemporary society, the 1830s society. And that meant not only restoring the proper observance of the Sabbath, which again for Christians is actually Sunday, not Saturday, but also things like temperance, like we need to make sure people are not drunk. Abolitionism, a lot of people in the North saw slavery as a sin and wanted to get rid of it. And it also leads to women's rights. That's sort of through the back door, but it's related. There are various other sins. I mean, anything you can, and prostitution. I mean, the textbook mentions this: prostitution, prison reform, you name it. They try to fix it and therefore bring about Jesus Christ's return. Really, I mean, ambitious people. Okay. The other issue here, though, and look, there's all the information right there. While many converts were inspired to join traditional denominations, and your textbook mentions this, others did form new denominations. So lots of people joined Congregationalist churches, Presbyterian churches, but others formed new denominations. And some of the denominations that were relatively new or were much more popular during this era were the denominations of Unitarianism and Universalism. I mentioned these two specifically because these two will come up in the evidence section. Some of the people who are saying we should allow the post offices to remain open are coming from the Unitarian and Universalist churches. So the Unitarians basically believed that God was one God, not a three-person God. So they reject the divinity of Jesus Christ. Again, that's for those of us who are a little bit more traditional about our Christianity. That's pretty radical. So they believe that there is one God, not a three-person God. They reject the divinity of Christ. They say Jesus was a great moral example, but he was not a divine creature. They also tend to believe that reason, rational thought, science, and philosophy can coexist with faith in God. They are big fans of free will. They reject the idea of humans as inherently corrupt or depraved. They also do not believe that any one religion has a monopoly on theological truth. So they are religious pluralists, which again, for them, would mean we definitely prefer the nation to stay out of religious conformity kinds of issues. They also believe that although the Bible was inspired by God, it was written by humans, and humans therefore could have made errors. I know, that's another big one. They also reject more traditional theological ideas like predestination. They reject the idea of eternal damnation, and certain ideas about the atonement were also rejected. And of course, if you don't believe God is God's only son, etc., that's going to, mess up your ideas about atonement. Now, the Universalists, the main thing to note about them is that they believe that all human beings would eventually be saved. So, they're pretty strong deviations, shall we say, from the more traditional denominations. So there were other less traditional outlets of religious expression that resulted in the formation of utopian societies. So some people, instead of joining traditional denominations, actually sort of removed themselves from society and formed utopian communities. One example is the Oneida community. You see up there on the right the Oneida Mansion. They're a very interesting group of people. Well, what to say? They rejected the idea of marriage, monogamous marriage. They believed that the biggest sin was actually the sin of private property, and they believed that within traditional marriage, women were seen as the private property of their husbands. So they tried to reform that sin by practicing complex marriage, and that, of course, is a very interesting phenomenon. If you want to know more about that, you can certainly Google that. Yeah, there it is. And this is also a period when we also have a new American religion born in this country, and that is the religion of Mormonism. So it's in this era of religious revival and cultural transformation that Joseph Smith, pictured there on the bottom, had his revelation that there were these golden plates of hieroglyphics that he was spiritually directed to translate into the Book of Mormon, and voila, we have a new American religion that is, again, something quite different from the traditional denominations. So, keeping all of that in mind, in this context, then, the concern about the domination of one set of religious beliefs perhaps makes a bit more sense. So some of the things that these Unitarians and Universalists are reacting to is, okay, if we start passing national laws with regard to morality and religion, who is going to be dictating those policies? It's probably not going to be, again, the religious minorities, but it might be the religious majority. And the religious minorities, those from the Universalist, Unitarianism, the Oneida community, etc., are uncomfortable with the idea of having their beliefs dictated by another group of people. So I hope that piques your interest a little bit in the chapter. I think it's a very interesting debate. I think it's really relevant to particularly our context that we're working from as Bethel folks, because we struggle, I think, even today with the role of the church and Christianity in our secular institutions. And this, I hope, this chapter, I hope makes you think even more complexly about that. All right, good luck, and have fun reading the chapter, posting, taking the quiz, etc.